This course contains recitations of the Quran in a secular context.
I need to be honest. The question of Islamic law, commonly though a bit erroneously called Sharia, and the even more problematic word jihad deserve well more than 30 minutes of your time. I could easily spend this lecture simply dispelling myths and misunderstandings about these two words, but this wouldn't necessarily leave you any closer to understanding what they are. What I want to propose instead is an introduction to how Islamic jurisprudence, called fiqh in Arabic, is grounded in particular Quranic injunctions, and then illustrate some of these legal considerations in relationship to jihad. Other scholars have written multiple volumes on both concepts, but I think there's a way to understand their function within the text of the Quran that points toward the later elaboration and codification of both concepts in the tradition as a whole. And, I should add, we'll see how both terms lend themselves to near endless dispute. But to start, what's so scary about Sharia and jihad? No other words in the Arabic language cause such widespread consternation in American society. Part of the problem is that they so often remain untranslated. Creeping Sharia sounds foreign and unfamiliar to many ears, but I'd guess that searching for God's will would ruffle fewer feathers. Likewise, global jihad conjures images of the burning Twin Towers, but the universal struggle for justice is something we might all want to pursue. The two interpretations I've given here illustrate the divide between how Sharia and jihad sound to those unfamiliar with the terms versus how they sound as concepts to many Muslims. But if we can learn to appreciate quinoa, yoga, and cappuccino, there might yet be hope for Sharia and jihad. Sharia can be translated rather simply as divine will, or more literally as path or way, what God wants from us and for us. As in Christianity and Judaism, this is more easily asserted than it is discerned. One scholar notes that Sharia's original use meant a watering place or path to water, a God-given, life-providing way. For example, here's how it's used in Surah 45 of the Quran. Now we have set you on a clear religious path, Sharia, so follow it. Do not follow the desires of those who lack knowledge. In this example, Sharia is an almost existential concept. Once on God's trail, stick to it. This is the prevailing usage of Sharia in the Quran, and it both sounds and is a long way from some form of penal code or authoritative legal practice. The discrepancy then begs the question, what occurred between these Quranic utterances and the concept as it's so often used today? The short version of a long answer is that an extensive interpretive tradition developed as Muslims attempted to derive ethical, legal, and political customs and institutions from the Quran. However, the notion of Sharia as a system of punishment, Hudud in Arabic, does have Quranic origins to shy away from verses that command or allow for corporeal punishment would be dishonest. The trick, as far as I see it, is to understand how the Quran negotiates between the religious path of a believer and the juridical pronouncements aimed at the community. If we can outline the rhetorical objective of the text, we can better understand how the sophisticated tradition of Islamic jurisprudence developed. The same is true of jihad. Literally, jihad means simply to struggle. And struggle, of course, can apply to many things. Struggle against one's enemies, struggle to do the right thing, or struggle to learn a new language. In the Quran, jihad is employed in all of these senses, physical force, moral effort, personal challenges, and it does not lay out any comprehensive system for understanding the term. For instance, Surah 61 says, "You who believe, shall I show you a bargain that will save you from painful torment? Have faith in God and His Messenger, and struggle, jihad, for His cause with your possessions and your persons. That is better for you if only you knew." Ignoring any context, one could read this multiple ways. Engage in armed struggle on God's behalf. Struggle to be generous to the poor or needy with your time and wealth. Or struggle to avoid sin so that you might enjoy paradise. Additionally, there's another Arabic word, qital, which means more literally to fight, that is used in the Quran, and it is quite distinct from the discussions of jihad. What seems evident in the text is that ideas about what we today call just war theory, the moral framework for aggressive action, are interspersed with broader concerns about what is incumbent upon believers in their exertion on God's behalf. Nevertheless, some interpretive traditions began around the 9th century that used the term jihad in more exclusively military ways. This was, as Asma Asfaruddin notes, despite the fact that the term jihad in Quranic usage is clearly a multivalent word, and as even a cursory reading of some of the related literature reveals, was understood as such by early religious authorities and scholars. And of course, the multivalence of the word is completely lost in the post-9/11 non-Arabic speaking context. In this case, the subtleties of a complex term are drowned out by the justifications of self-righteously murderous terrorists, and, in a kind of supreme irony, also by those wishing to disparage all of Islamic tradition by equating Osama bin Laden with all Muslims. Obviously, we can and need to do better. In order to illustrate how Sharia and fiqh, that is, jurisprudence, work in the Islamic tradition, I think it would be useful for us to work through a relatively simple interpretive exercise, similar to one I use with my students. Once we've engaged in this particular sort of Quranic interpretation, we can return to the question of jihad and think about its meaning in the text. In class, after explaining the basics of Islamic jurisprudence, I ask my students a rather straightforward question. Can Muslims drink beer? Then I ask them to issue a fatwa about drinking beer. Fatwa is another one of those unnecessarily scary words. In Arabic, it simply means opinion, and in the legal sense, it means a judge's or lawyer's opinion or ruling about a matter of law. And, as with all opinions, legal or otherwise, we often find a range of viewpoints. So, how would we go about constructing a fatwa about whether or not Muslims can drink beer? Clever students quickly note that, being human, Muslims are entirely capable of drinking beer, seeing as how they possess mouths and throats and stomachs. And this is partly the point. There's a keen difference between can and should. But it's attention to these sorts of small details on which so much legal wrangling depends. Once we've gotten the smart aleck answer out of the way, there are a few questions. First, what does the Quran say about beer? This question reveals a foundational question. What sources of authority apply to an observant person? Obviously, the Quran is the first source of authority, but not necessarily the only one. In addition to the Quran, legal opinions rely upon the Hadith literature, the collections of sayings and actions of the Prophet, along with the Sunnah, the customs of the community during the Prophet's lifetime. In our test case about beer, unfortunately, the Quran, Hadith, and Sunnah are all silent, offering no guidance. But Dr. Oliver, you might be thinking, I thought it was common knowledge that Islam forbids alcohol. It's this assumption that makes our test case so interesting. There's no singular Islam that sets out clear rules about all manner of life. Just as for Christians, Jews, and Hindus, much daily activity is a cumulative process of textual, historical, and social interpretation. While it's true that many Muslims eschew drinking alcohol, how that became custom is a rather interesting process of interpretation. So, in the case of beer, about which the Quran is silent, at least in a literal sense, another source of legal reasoning is required. Reasoning by analogy, qiyas in Arabic, leads us back to the Quran in that we can find instances in the text that mention alcohol. There are, in fact, only 3 such places in the Quran, but they are instructive. Surah 4 offers the most straightforward guidance. You who believe, do not come anywhere near the prayer if you are intoxicated, not until you know what you are saying. This is obviously clear enough. Don't be drunk when you pray. But it's far from an outright prohibition. Second, we can look at Surah 2, which says, they ask you about intoxicants and gambling. Say, there is great sin in both, and some benefit for people. The sin is greater than the benefit. While this can be read as more clearly restrictive, there's obviously still some ambiguity present. Finally, in Surah 5, we read, you who believe, intoxicants and gambling, idolatrous practices, and divining with arrows are repugnant acts, Satan's doing. Shun them so that you may prosper. With intoxicants and gambling, Satan seeks only to incite enmity and hatred among you, and to stop you remembering God in prayer. Will you not give them up? This final verse seems to be the most unambiguous of the 3, equating intoxicants with Satan's doing. However, the translation I've quoted here is somewhat misleading on this account. The word translated as intoxicants in both Surah 2 and Surah 5 is Khamr, more commonly translated as wine, and likely meant wine made from either grapes or dates. It was the only alcohol specifically mentioned in the whole of the Quran, and is the same word used in Surah 47 when describing the pleasures of paradise. Although we should remember that wine in heaven is said not to be intoxicating. Thus, if we are to read the Quran literally and at face value, being drunk at prayer is forbidden, and khamr is to be avoided. So can Muslims drink beer? One might reasonably argue that having one beer wouldn't get you drunk, nor is it khamr, so what's the harm? But given the general Islamic prohibition against any sort of alcohol, other sorts of interpretation obviously take place. While I said a moment ago that the hadith is silent about beer, it isn't silent about alcohol in a more general sense. There are a number of hadith that claim the Prophet Muhammad, in response to questions about other sorts of intoxicants, grouped them in with khamr as forbidden. But as I've previously discussed, not every hadith is accepted as authoritative by all Muslims. Given all of this, we thus far have 3 sources of authority: Quran, hadith, and analogy, and all 3 leave some room for ambiguity. Taking up and evaluating this ambiguity thus becomes the job of the legal scholar. Let's take a look at an extended passage from one such opinion to see how this works. This opinion is from the Hanafi school, one of the 4 primary Sunni legal traditions. Forbidden drinks are 4. 1. Khamr, the juice of the grape fermented until strong, gathering foam which settles. 2. That juice, boiled until less than a third of it is gone. 3. The infusion of dates, which is sakar. And 4. The fermented infusion of raisins. The first of these is khamr. Some people say it is a name for every inebriating drink. According to the Prophet's hadith, every inebriator is khamr. He also said khamr is made from these 2 trees, and pointed to the grapevine and the palm. The prohibition of khamr is absolute, but the prohibition of other drinks is supposititious. Yahya ibn Ma'in disputed the authenticity of the first hadith. The second is the demonstration of the ruling, establishing the name Khamr for all strong fermented drinks made from these two sources. This passage goes on for some time, continuing to debate the scope of the prohibition, but we can see some of the key features in legal argument here. Recognizing the dispute about how Khamr is to be understood, the scholar notes two hadith, one that expands the definition and one that delimits it. The author then rejects the first hadith by appealing to another scholar. The opinion, a fatwa, also discusses the penalties for drinking Khamr, said here to be 80 lashes, but also opines that drinking other beverages that are analogous to Khamr does not warrant the same punishment, as the prohibition is one of opinion and not direct revelation. While this fatwa is something of a minority opinion, indeed, the three other Sunni legal schools hold a stricter prohibition against consuming any alcohol. It illustrates how the debate about the Quran developed during the classical period from the 8th to 12th centuries. What distinguishes the legal traditions from one to the other is how they prioritize the various sources of authority available to them. All schools accept the Quran as obviously preeminent, and the Sunnah and Hadith are collectively the second source of authority. But here, differences began to emerge. Some schools, in hoping to attain the fullest account of the time of the Prophet, sought out and accepted as legitimate vast amounts of Hadith sayings. Others, as in the example above, were more suspicious of different Hadith collections and engaged in vigorous debate as to what sayings were acceptably authentic. This inevitably resulted in a smaller corpus of Hadith for some schools, and they thus turned to other forms of argument. I've already noted one of these sources of authority, Qiyas, or argument by way of analogy, and the other principal option is ijma, or the consensus of the community. In addition to these, tradition in a broad sense, called taqlid, a jurist's professional opinion, ijtihad, concern for the public good, or political authority might additionally supplement or supplant a line of legal opinion making. Regardless of the order or weight given to any of these sources of authority, legal opinions sort actions into 5 distinct categories: required, permissible, neutral, reprehensible, and forbidden. So, following our test case above, the Hanafi school of law found the drinking of alcohol, other than the forbidden Khamr, to be reprehensible, though lawful, while the 3 other schools, the Hanbali, Shafi'i, and Maliki, find drinking any alcohol to be forbidden. These schools are named after famous early scholars, some of whom were intentionally developing legal principles and others not, but each is associated with a certain attitude toward the different sources of authority. For example, the Maliki school often favors a kind of communal traditionalism, while the Hanbali school emphasizes sunnah and accounts of the Prophet, an approach we today might call originalism. Shiites have their own distinct school, characterized by an emphasis on hadith that pertain to the Prophet's cousin Ali and his family, as well as a rejection of both qiyas, analogous arguments, and ijma, community traditions. These are replaced with the authority of the imams, a class of scholars given special consideration in the Shiite tradition. Given all of these complexities, and not to mention numerous details I can't account for in this brief space, it should be no wonder that Sharia is an exceedingly complex and diverse phenomenon. Even within a given legal school, diversity of opinion tends to be the rule rather than the exception. For this reason, when I hear fears about creeping Sharia, I'm more confused than anything else. What is it that's creeping? Some particular legal opinions? As is the case with any other legal system the world over, the opinions of lawyers only ever have effect when coupled with the power and authority to enforce those opinions. This brings us, finally, to the question of jihad. While a jurist or scholar might opine about the necessity of jihad, that opinion only has force when acted upon. And, as with so much else, reading the Quranic passages on jihad is especially complex, much more so than prohibitions on alcohol. Asma Afsardin, an expert on the Quranic and historic context for jihad, whom we've turned to before in this lecture, works through some of these complications for us. We can look, for example, at one of the more notorious passages from Surah 2. I'll quote it at length to give both context and a sense of how the text engages in a kind of internal debate about fighting. Fight in God's cause against those who fight you, but do not overstep the limits. God does not love those who overstep the limits. Kill them wherever you encounter them and drive them out from where they drove you out, for persecution is more serious than killing. Do not fight them at the sacred mosque unless they fight you there. If they do fight you, kill them. This is what such disbelievers deserve. But if they stop, then God is most forgiving and merciful. Fight them until there is no more persecution and worship is devoted to God. If they cease hostilities, there can be no further hostility except towards aggressors. There's a lot to unpack from these verses. First, it's useful to note that jihad as a word is not employed here at all. The word translated as fight is a term I mentioned earlier, qital, and is quite distinct from jihad. Second, nearly all of the Quranic verses that countenance fighting, either qital or jihad when used in a somewhat martial sense, engage in this kind of oscillation between exhortation and dissuading. While fighting is sometimes endorsed, so is the cessation of fighting when aggression has ceased. Indeed, the Quran repeatedly counsels that God prefers peace. Third, these verses are routinely interpreted to mean that fighting is legitimated only in response to aggression, and that aggression itself, or preemptive war, is forbidden. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Afsardin reminds us that many of the Quranic verses regarding fighting are read in historical context and are taken to refer to specific crises experienced by Muhammad and the believers. In this instance, some commentators understand these verses to apply exclusively to Arab polytheists during one particular moment, and thus are limited by that occasion. Afsardin then goes on to illustrate how, after Muhammad, the meaning and applicability of jihad, including whether or not offensive war was prohibited, became an object of intense juridical debate as the first two great Islamic empires expanded. For instance, jurists from the Shafi'i and Hanafi schools disputed the concepts of Dar al-Islam and Dar al-harb, the abode of Islam and the abode of war, respectively, within which fighting might be limited or justified. These ideas of places or lands where fighting would be forbidden or allowed are not found in the Quran or the tradition, but were promoted during the Abbasid Empire's long rule as means of categorizing the various lands they conquered or engaged with during its imperial expansion. In other words, some version of what we can call Islamic just war theory was developed based upon ambiguous elements of a complicated text in relationship to the evolving political needs of a global empire. As history progressed, ideas about jihad likewise evolved, always contextually shaped, and they continue to evolve today. One way jihad has been understood is by differentiating between two types of struggle, what have come to be called the greater and lesser jihads. According to this reading of the text, the lesser jihad is of the military sort, the kind of jihad a nation-state might engage in. The greater jihad, however, is more difficult and is the spiritual struggle against one's carnal self. Numerous hadith support this reading of jihad, and it became popular among theological, philosophical, and mystical interpreters of the Quran and Islamic tradition. And, contrary to some assumptions, it remains the most prevalent view of jihad among Muslims today. For the vast majority of Muslims, both today and throughout the past, reading the Quran and putting it into practice is the challenge of accepting God's will over and against our own selfish desires. Rather than a book of laws or political theory, the Quran is most often read as a meditation and reflection on our individual struggle to live in accordance with God's mercy and compassion. So it is fitting that we conclude our course in the next lecture by delving into this personal exercise that lies so close to the heart of Islamic faith.